You know, there's something deeply compelling about urgency. It captures our attention in a way that few other things can. When someone says, if you don't act now, something will be lost, that strikes a very old and primal chord in us. It's not just a marketing tactic. Although marketers have exploited it with ruthless efficiency, it's a psychological truth. We are wired to respond to time limits, to threats of loss, to moments where the cost of inaction outweighs the discomfort of decision. The title of this speech, "If you don't receive money today, I will delete this video," sounds provocative, maybe even manipulative at first glance. But think about it. Embedded in that message is a powerful expression of urgency, of consequence. There's a timeline, there's a threat, and more importantly, there's something at stake. That's why it works, because people listen when they know the clock is ticking. Psychologically, urgency bypasses our rational filters and speaks directly to the limbic brain, the part that's concerned with survival. It's the same mechanism that kept our ancestors alive when the rustling in the bushes might have been a predator. You couldn't afford to deliberate endlessly back then. Action was necessary. Fight or flight. Now or never. But here's where it gets interesting. In today's world, most of our threats are abstract. They're not lions, they're deadline. They're not predators, they're opportunities slipping through our fingers. And we've become increasingly desensitized. We're bombarded daily by headlines screaming, "last chance," "breaking news," "limited time only," to the point where urgency becomes noise. We tune it out, but that's a mistake, because not all urgency is manufactured. Some of it is real. Some of it matters. That's why invoking urgency can be a double-edged sword. If you cry wolf too often, people stop believing you. But if you never signal urgency, if you never set boundaries, never define consequences, then people stop listening altogether. They think you'll always be there. They assume your content, your effort, your presence is infinite. But it isn't. Nothing is. Urgency, when it's authentic, is a boundary. It's a way of saying, this is the line. I am not going to give indefinitely without reciprocity, and that's not selfish. That's sustainable. Because when you don't define limits, when you don't make the value of your time and effort clear, people begin to devalue it, not because they're malicious, but because that's what humans do. We take for granted what seems endless. So when someone says, "If you don't receive money today, I will delete this video," it's not necessarily a threat. It can be a declaration of self-respect. A reminder that time, creativity, energy, these things cost something. And they're not just transactional, they're existential. Your work, your voice, your vision, they represent hours of your life you'll never get back. And if no one sees that, or chooses not to honor that well, at some point you stop offering it for free. Now let's step back and look at the broader philosophical point. Urgency reveals priorities. What you rush to protect or rush to respond to that tells you what you value. It's a mirror. If you won't get out of bed for your own goals, but you leap into action for someone else's crisis, what does that say about your hierarchy of values? About your self-respect? Urgency forces us to reckon with these uncomfortable truths. And that's why people avoid it, because it demands clarity. And clarity is dangerous. Once you see what matters, you can no longer pretend not to act. There's also something spiritual about it. The Stoics said, "You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think." That's not morbid. That's urgency. That's recognizing that time is finite and therefore sacred. When you treat it that way, when you treat every moment, every message, every piece of work as if it might be your last, your output becomes sharper, more sincere. You stop wasting words, you stop waiting for perfect conditions, and you start speaking with purpose. So yes, the message might sound harsh on the surface, but beneath it lies something crucial. A principle, a challenge, a reminder that value isn't just about what you give, it's also about what you demand. Urgency, when rightly understood, is not panic. It's presence. It's precision. It's the refusal to live in delay. And so the next time you hear a message that sounds urgent, don't dismiss it automatically as manipulation. Ask yourself instead, what is really at stake here? What am I avoiding? And what would I do if I truly believed that time was running out? Because it is. And that's what makes it worth everything. Ownership. It's a word we throw around so casually in the digital age, but very few people actually understand what it means, not just legally, but existentially. When I speak about ownership, I'm not merely referring to the right to control a file or the ability to press upload or delete. I'm talking about the deeper philosophical truth that when you create something, when you invest your time, your thought, your suffering, and your attention into a work of video, a piece of writing, an idea, you are binding part of your identity to it. You are embedding yourself into that creation, and that makes it yours in a profound sense. Now, we live in a world where content is everywhere. Anyone can record, post, share, remix, and suddenly something you created becomes detached from you. It starts living a life of its own. That's part of the magic of the internet, but it's also part of the tragedy, because the moment you put something out into the world, people forget that it cost you something. They consume it in seconds. They scroll past it, maybe drop a like, maybe not. But what they often don't see, and perhaps never will, is that you stayed up until 3 a.m., perfecting that sentence, that you hesitated before sharing something vulnerable, that you exposed a piece of your psyche to strangers who may never care. Digital ownership, then, is about more than copyright. It's about dignity. It's about saying, this has my name on it, and that means something. That's what makes the idea of deleting a video or threatening to so psychologically significant. It's not just a tantrum. It's a boundary. It's an assertion of control in a space where control is constantly being eroded. The internet has trained us to believe that everything should be free, instantly available, and infinite. But when everything is free, nothing is valued. And when nothing is valued, nothing is protected. So what do you do as a creator? As someone who's actually contributing to the cultural landscape, you start reclaiming the idea that your work, and by extension, your voice, has intrinsic worth. And sometimes that means you have to be willing to take it away. There's a kind of power in being willing to destroy what you created. Not out of spite, but out of self-respect. It's the same power a craftsman has when he refuses to sell a sculpture to someone who doesn't appreciate it. Or when a writer burns the manuscript because it doesn't live up to their standards. That's not weakness, that's ownership. That's responsibility. And this is where we touch something archetypal. In mythology, the creator is always a figure of both generosity and judgment. Think of the god of Genesis, who creates, yes, but who also expels. The act of creation is followed by the act of limitation, boundaries, consequences. That's how meaning is sustained. Without that structure, the creation dissolves into chaos. So when I say, if you don't receive money today, I will delete this video, what I'm really doing is drawing a line. I'm saying this is not a product to be endlessly consumed without cost. This is not an infinite stream of content that will flow regardless of whether it's valued or not. Because if it isn't, valued if the response is apathy or entitlement, then maybe it shouldn't exist. Not because it's unworthy, but because you are not yet ready to recognize what it means. That's a tough pill to swallow, but it's necessary. We cannot keep pretending that creative output is some kind of endless buffet, where people take what they want and leave nothing in return. That is spiritually unsustainable. That leads to burnout, cynicism, and eventually silence. And you know what silence is? It's the death of dialogue. It's the moment when the creator stops believing that the audience is capable of listening. But it doesn't have to get there. It's entirely possible to build a new kind of digital relationship, one rooted not in entitlement, but in mutual recognition. You, the creator, offer something meaningful. The audience, in turn, acknowledges its value, maybe through financial support, maybe through engagement, maybe simply through a genuine thank you. That exchange is what transforms content into connection. And that's what makes the whole thing worthwhile. The key is remembering that ownership doesn't just mean control. It also means responsibility. You are responsible for what you bring into the world, but you are also responsible for protecting it and for protecting yourself from the illusion that your work is only as valuable as the attention it receives. That's not true. Your work is valuable because you made it. And if you don't stand up for that truth, no one else will. So ask yourself, what have you created that you're afraid to protect? What part of your voice have you given away too freely, hoping someone would just notice? And what would happen if instead you took full ownership, even if that meant withdrawing it until it was truly respected? Because in the end, the power to create must be matched by the courage to say, this belongs to me, and I will not let it be devalued. And maybe, just maybe, that's where true freedom begins. Certainly, here's an 800-word expansion of key point 3. Emotional leverage and online communication, written in the tone and structure you've requested. There's a strange phenomenon we're witnessing in the digital era. People are communicating more than ever, but they're understanding each other less. At the core of that paradox lies the way we use emotional leverage, especially online. We've learned, often unconsciously, that the most effective way to get someone's attention is to trigger their emotion, not necessarily their intellect, not their reason, but their gut. We don't ask anymore. We demand. We don't invite. We threaten. And we cloak that tactic in the language of urgency or injustice or desperation. You see it all the time. If you cared, you'd respond. If you don't do X, I'll walk away. This is your last chance. These are not just casual expressions, they are pressure points, and they're incredibly effective in the short term. That's the danger. They work, which is precisely why people keep using them. Psychologically, this is what we call coercive framing, when someone uses a negative outcome to manipulate another person's behavior. It's very common in dysfunctional relationships. It's also the exact same dynamic that plays out on social media and in content creation spaces, where creators and audiences form an increasingly tense and transactional relationship. When a creator says, "If I don't receive support today, I'm deleting this video," it can easily be misinterpreted as a guilt trip. Maybe it is, depending on the context. But more often, it's a cry for reciprocity in a world that's trained us to expect everything for free. It's a pushback against the growing apathy that emerges when someone gives over and over again without receiving acknowledgement, let alone support. Now, there's a moral danger here, and I don't want to ignore that, because emotional leverage can quickly spiral into manipulation if it's not used with care. If you're constantly relying on threats of loss to get what you want, you're not inspiring, you're controlling. And you might get short-term compliance, sure, but you will absolutely lose long-term trust. People begin to tune out when they feel they're being emotionally blackmailed. But here's where it gets nuanced. There's a difference between manipulation and healthy boundary setting, and the difference is intention. If the intent is to punish someone for not giving you what you want, that's coercion. But if the intent is to draw a line around your own energy, your own time, your own worth, that's not coercion. That's self-respect. Sometimes you say, "If this doesn't change, I'm walking away." Not to make the other person suffer, but to stop yourself from suffering further. That's not an attack, that's a survival mechanism. Online communication distorts this line. It flattens emotional nuance. You can't hear tone. You can't see the person's exhaustion, or their sincerity, or their quiet desperation. You just see the words, stark, absolute, and often misread. That's the cost of communicating in bite-sized broadcasted fragments. And yet, we have to adapt. We have to learn to communicate emotional truth without resorting to threat or performance. We need to reclaim honesty, because too often now people feel that they have to dramatize their pain just to be heard. That's tragic. And it's dangerous, because over time, it leads to emotional inflation where nothing is taken seriously unless it's expressed in extremes. A person says, "I'm tired," and no one listens. So next time they say, "I'm broken," still nothing. So they escalate, "I'm done." Only then does the world respond. But by that point, the communication has become a weapon, not a bridge. What we need desperately is a return to real dialogue, not just louder signals, but deeper signals. Signals grounded in truth, even when that truth is uncomfortable, especially then. So yes, emotional leverage is real, and it's powerful, but its power must be tempered with responsibility. If you're a creator or anyone communicating publicly, you have to ask yourself, am I using emotion to connect or to control? Am I inviting people into truth, or am I baiting them into reacting? Those are not rhetorical questions. They're the foundation of ethical communication. Likewise, if you're on the receiving end, if someone says something like, "I'll delete this if I don't get support," instead of dismissing it as drama, ask yourself, why would someone feel the need to say that in the first place? What's being ignored? What pain is going unacknowledged? Because that statement, however clumsy or uncomfortable, might be the only language they have left to say, "I matter. What I make matters. Please don't treat me like I'm invisible." And that's the core of it, isn't it? No one really wants to manipulate. What they want is to be seen, to be valued. And when that's missing, people reach for whatever tools they can, even if those tools are crude. But it doesn't have to be that way. We can build better forms of connection. We can be clearer about our needs, more honest about our limits, and more compassionate in our responses. That's what elevates communication from noise to meaning, from reaction to relationship. So, here's the invitation. Next time you feel the urge to use emotion as leverage, pause. Ask yourself, is there a better way to say what I really mean? And if you're on the other side receiving that message, ask, is this a manipulation or is this someone finally telling the truth? Because sometimes the difference between being heard and being ignored is just the courage to speak without fear and the compassion to listen without judgment. What do you really value? It's a deceptively simple question. Not what you say you value, not the ideals you list on a resume or write in a bio, but what your actions, your sacrifices, your attention reveal about you, because that's where your real values live. Not in your words, but in your patterns. And when you start to examine those patterns honestly, unflinchingly, you might find that what you value isn't what you thought at all. People say they value meaning, but they spend hours chasing distractions. They say they value relationships, but they trade authentic connection for digital validation. They say they value truth, but they avoid discomfort like the plague. And creators, those who pour their soul into their work, often say they value impact. But when the views drop, or the money doesn't come, or the algorithm ignores them, they begin to question everything. Why? Because attention is addictive, and it's quietly replaced something more important: purpose. This is the philosophical heart of the matter. What do you really want when you create something, or share something, or ask something of the world? Is it the money? Is it the reach? Or is it the chance to be part of something meaningful, to build, to teach, to wake someone up? The truth is, we're all living under the influence of invisible hierarchies of value. And if you don't consciously define yours, someone else will define them for you. Usually it's the culture. And the culture, for all its complexity, tends to worship three things: money, attention, and speed. That's the trifecta. If something makes money, if it goes viral, and if it happens quickly, then it's celebrated. Even if it's meaningless, even if it's dishonest, even if it's empty. And so you get creators, brilliant, sensitive, thoughtful people who start compromising. Little by little, they change their tone to suit the algorithm. They cut out nuance to please the masses. They focus more on metrics than message. Not because they're greedy or shallow, but because they're tired. Because they're trying to survive in a system that rewards noise over depth. But there's a cost. And the cost is authenticity. The cost is self-respect. When you chase value on terms you don't believe in, you eventually forget who you were before you started chasing. So the question becomes, how do you realign? How do you recenter yourself around what actually matters? You start by telling the truth, not just out loud, but internally. You sit down and ask yourself, what would I do if no one ever applauded? If no one paid me? If no one shared or praised or acknowledged my work, would I still make it? Would I still say it? Would I still believe it?